They say denial is a powerful drug. But what happens when the most powerful man in Europe, a dictator who commanded millions, slowly begins to see the cracks in his own empire? When did Adolf Hitler, the architect of the Third Reich, first realize that his dream of a 1,000-year Reich was crumbling into dust? The answer isn't simple. It wasn't a single moment of clarity, no dramatic revelation where everything suddenly made sense. It was a slow, agonizing process, a series of brutal awakenings, each one harder to ignore than the last, each one pushing him closer to a truth he refused to accept. If history teaches us anything about human nature, it's that we see what we want to see, especially when the alternative is too terrifying to contemplate. And for Hitler, accepting defeat meant accepting the collapse of everything he had built, everything he believed in, everything that gave his life meaning. This is not just a story about when a dictator realized he would lose a war. It's a story about the human capacity for self-deception, about how pride can blind even the most intelligent minds, and about the devastating cost of refusing to face reality. Let's go back to where the illusion first began to crack. December 1941. The gates of Moscow. The German Wehrmacht stood at the edge of the Soviet capital. Victory seemed inevitable. Just one final push away. Hitler's generals had delivered triumph after triumph. Poland fell in weeks. France, the great military power of Europe, collapsed in barely a month. The Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, had worked everywhere it had been tried. Denmark, Norway, Yugoslavia, Greece. The German war machine seemed unstoppable. Why would Russia be different? Hitler had told his generals that the Soviet Union was a house of cards, ready to collapse at the first hard kick. His ideology told him that the Slavic peoples were inferior, that their communist system was weak, that their leadership was incompetent. The invasion, Operation Barbarossa, had gone well at first. Millions of Soviet soldiers had been captured. Entire armies had been encircled and destroyed. Kiev had fallen. Leningrad was under siege. Moscow was next, the final prize. But then something happened that Hitler had not planned for. Winter arrived. Not just any winter, but a Russian winter. The kind of cold that European soldiers had never experienced. The kind that froze oil in tank engines, that turned steel brittle and weapons useless, that made men's fingers fall off from frostbite. The temperature dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. German troops, still wearing summer uniforms because Hitler had assured them the war would be over before winter, began to die, not from Soviet bullets, but from the cold itself. Soldiers huddled in foxholes trying to start fires with frozen wood. Horses, essential for moving supplies, collapsed and died by the thousands. Vehicles broke down and couldn't be repaired. And then, on December 5th, the Red Army counterattacked. Fresh divisions from Siberia, equipped for winter warfare, slammed into the exhausted German lines. For the first time since the war began, the Wehrmacht retreated. Hitler's forces, the ones he had called invincible, were pushed back from Moscow's outskirts. In some sectors, the retreat turned into a rout. Units that had advanced hundreds of miles now fled westward through the snow. In the command posts scattered across the frozen Russian landscape, German officers who had spent months celebrating victories now stared at maps in stunned silence. The unthinkable had happened. The invincible Wehrmacht had been stopped, had been beaten back. Did Hitler realize it then? Did he understand in that moment that his invasion of the Soviet Union had failed? Perhaps he did, for a brief moment, but then something happened that would define the rest of the war. He refused to accept it. A temporary setback, he told his generals. We will regroup, we will prepare, we will attack again in the spring, and next time we will not stop until Moscow falls. The Führer's will would prevail. He fired his commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch, for suggesting that the army needed to retreat further to defensible positions. He took personal command of the army himself, and he issued an order: no retreat, not one step backward. It was a decision born from desperation and pride, and while it may have prevented a complete collapse that winter, it established a pattern that would haunt Germany for the rest of the war. Hitler would never allow strategic retreats, even when they made military sense. He would never accept that his plans could fail. But some of his generals knew better. They had seen the endless columns of Soviet reinforcements, the vast distances that swallowed up their armies, the brutal conditions that destroyed men and machines. In private conversations, in guarded letters home, they whispered the forbidden thought that none dared speak aloud. This war cannot be won. Yet Hitler refused to listen, and that refusal would cost millions of lives. Summer 1942. The drive south. Hitler convinced himself that 1941 had been an anomaly. With better preparation, with more focus, Germany could still win in the east. He planned a new offensive, Case Blue. This time the target would be the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial city of Stalingrad. It was a plan that revealed both Hitler's strategic thinking and his fatal flaw. He needed oil, Germany's war machine ran on petroleum, and supplies were running dangerously low. If he could capture the Soviet oil fields, he could fuel his armies and starve the Soviets of their resources. But the plan was too ambitious. It divided German forces across impossible distances, splitting them between two objectives hundreds of miles apart. It stretched supply lines to the breaking point. It violated the basic principle of concentration of force. Field Marshal Wilhelm List tried to explain the problems to Hitler. The distances were too great, the logistics too complicated. Hitler relieved him of command. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock raised concerns about overextension. Hitler dismissed him as well, replacing him with officers who would not question his judgment. The pattern was becoming clear. Anyone who questioned the Führer's strategic vision was removed, and so the Wehrmacht drove deeper into southern Russia, further from their supply bases, closer to catastrophe. By late summer, German forces were approaching Stalingrad. The city wasn't particularly important strategically. It was a manufacturing center, yes, but it could have been bypassed. What made it important was its name, Stalin's city. For Hitler, capturing it became an obsession, a matter of prestige and ego. The battle that followed would become one of the bloodiest in human history. German soldiers fought street by street, building by building, room by room. The Soviets refused to yield an inch. They turned every structure into a fortress, every pile of rubble into a fighting position. The battle became a meat grinder, consuming men and materials at a horrifying rate. Factory workers fought alongside soldiers. Women and children helped defend the city. The Volga River behind the city was the only supply line, and German aircraft bombed it constantly, yet Soviet reinforcements kept coming. By autumn, the German Sixth Army, which had conquered so much of Europe, was bogged down in a city that was supposed to fall in days. Soldiers joked grimly that they were fighting for every staircase, every kitchen. The jokes masked a growing desperation. And then, on November 19th, the Soviets sprang their trap. The Stalingrad catastrophe. Two Soviet army groups attacked simultaneously, one from the north, one from the south. They bypassed the German forces in Stalingrad and struck at the weaker Romanian and Italian armies protecting the flanks. Within 4 days the pincers met. The entire German Sixth Army, over 250,000 men, was encircled. General Friedrich Paulus, commanding the Sixth Army, immediately requested permission to break out while there was still time. The answer from Hitler was unequivocal. No, the Sixth Army would hold Stalingrad. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, promised that his aircraft could supply the trapped army by air. It was a fantasy. The Luftwaffe could barely deliver a fraction of what was needed. Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Temperatures dropped, food ran out, ammunition dwindled. Wounded men lay in makeshift hospitals with no medical supplies. Soldiers began eating their horses, then their leather belts. Paulus sent increasingly desperate messages to Hitler. Allow us to break out. Allow us to retreat. Let us save what can be saved. Every message received the same response. Hold your positions. Reinforcements are coming. Relief is on the way. The reinforcements never came. The relief never arrived. Here's where we need to pause and ask ourselves something important. Did Hitler know at this point that he was condemning those men to death? Did he understand that Stalingrad was lost? That the Sixth Army was doomed? Or was he still caught in his delusion of invincibility? The evidence suggests he knew. His staff officers knew. His military advisors knew. Intelligence reports made it clear that the situation was hopeless. But Hitler could not bring himself to give the order to retreat. To do so would be to admit failure, to admit that his grand strategy had failed, to admit that he, the great military genius, had made a catastrophic mistake. So instead, he sacrificed an entire army to preserve his pride. On February 2, 1943, the last remnants of the Sixth Army surrendered. Of the 250,000 men who had been encircled, only about 5,000 would ever return to Germany. The rest died in the battle, or in Soviet prisoner of war camps. Stalingrad was more than a military defeat, it was a psychological earthquake. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. For the first time, the German people began to doubt whether their Führer could actually win the war. And Hitler himself, he declared 3 days of national mourning. He promoted Paulus to field marshal, knowing that no German field marshal had ever surrendered. It was a hint that Paulus should commit suicide rather than be captured. Paulus ignored the hint, and surrendered anyway. In private, he blamed the generals, the soldiers, the weather, everyone but himself. But some who were close to him noticed a change. He became more withdrawn, his health began to deteriorate. His left hand developed a tremor that would grow worse as the war continued. Did he realize then that Germany would lose? Perhaps, but if he did, he pushed the thought away and kept fighting. July 1943, Kursk, the last gamble. Hitler needed a victory to restore momentum, to prove that Germany could still win in the East. He ordered one final massive offensive, Operation Citadel, aimed at the Kursk salient, a bulge in the Soviet lines that jutted westward into German-held territory. If successful, the operation would encircle and destroy multiple Soviet armies. It would shorten the German front line. It would show the world that Germany was still capable of offensive action. It would be the largest tank battle in history. But the German generals were deeply skeptical. Intelligence reports indicated that the Soviets knew the attack was coming. They had fortified the Kursk salient with multiple defensive lines, thousands of anti-tank guns, minefields that stretched for miles. The element of surprise, so crucial to blitzkrieg tactics, was completely gone. General Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored warfare, tried to convince Hitler to cancel the operation. Is it really necessary to attack this year at all in the East? He asked. Hitler admitted that the thought of the attack made his stomach turn, but he ordered it anyway, hoping that new German heavy tanks, the Tigers and Panthers, would make the difference. The offensive launched on July 5, 1943. From the first day it was clear the operation was failing. German armor ran into defensive positions deeper and stronger than anything they had encountered before. Soviet artillery and anti-tank guns destroyed German tanks by the hundreds. The new Panthers, rushed into production, broke down mechanically. The German advance, which was supposed to punch through Soviet defenses in days, managed only a few miles before grinding to a halt. And then the Soviets counterattacked with fresh reserve armies that the Germans hadn't known existed. Within 2 weeks, Operation Citadel was cancelled. It was the first time in the war that Hitler had called off a major offensive before achieving its objectives. From that moment on, Germany would never again launch a large-scale offensive in the east. Every battle from Kursk onward would be defensive, a slow, grinding retreat westward toward Berlin. Did Hitler realize it then? His actions suggest he did. On some level, after Kursk, something fundamental changed in his behavior. His public speeches became less frequent, his appearances more rare. He spent more time in his various headquarters, the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, the Berghof in Bavaria, surrounded by yes-men and dreamers who promised miracle weapons and impossible victories. But in private moments when his guard was down, the facade cracked. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and one of the few people with regular access to him, later described several conversations from late 1943 and early 1944. In one, Hitler admitted that the war could probably no longer be won militarily. Germany's only hope, he said, was that the alliance between the Western democracies and the Soviet communists would collapse. They would start fighting each other, and Germany could negotiate peace with one side against the other. It was wishful thinking, a fantasy, but it revealed that Hitler understood, somewhere in his mind, that Germany could not win through military force alone. The question was whether he would act on that understanding, whether he would seek a negotiated peace while Germany still had some bargaining power. He didn't. Instead, he clung to hope in wonder weapons, the V-1 and V-2 rockets that would terrorize London, jet aircraft that would sweep the skies clean of Allied bombers, new U-boats that would starve Britain. Each technological development was hailed as a potential war winner, a magic solution that would reverse Germany's fortunes. None of them would be enough.
June 6, 19. By the end of the first day they had established a foothold. Within weeks it was clear they were there to stay. Hitler had known an invasion was coming. The only questions had been where and when. He had fortified the entire Atlantic coast with the Atlantic Wall,
a system of bunkers, gun emplacements, obstacles and minefields. But the defenses had weaknesses, gaps in coverage, not enough mobile reserves to counterattack quickly. And Hitler had made a crucial mistake. He had positioned many of the panzer divisions too far from the coast, keeping them under his personal control. When the invasion came, his field commanders couldn't use them without his permission, and Hitler was asleep when the first reports arrived. His staff refused to wake him. By the time he authorized the use of the armored reserves, it was too late. The Allies had consolidated their beachhead. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, Hitler's most famous general, was commanding Army Group B in France. He had seen the vast armada that the Allies had assembled. He had witnessed the overwhelming air superiority that allowed Allied fighters and bombers to destroy anything that moved during daylight hours. He toured the Normandy defenses after the invasion and came to a grim conclusion. The war was over. Germany had no chance of winning. The only rational course of action was to negotiate peace with the Western Allies, before the Soviets overran all of Germany. Perhaps the Americans and British could be convinced to join Germany against the Soviets. It was a slim hope, but it was the only hope. Rommel tried to convince Hitler. The conversation did not go well. Hitler accused Rommel of defeatism, of lacking faith in Germany's ability to fight. When Rommel pressed the issue, pointing out that Germany was running out of men, out of fuel, out of weapons, Hitler exploded in rage. There would be no peace negotiation. There would be no surrender. Germany would fight to the last man, the last bullet, the last drop of blood. If the German people could not achieve victory, Hitler declared, then they deserved to perish. The stronger Eastern peoples would prove themselves superior, and Germany would cease to exist. It was a chilling statement that revealed just how detached from reality Hitler had become. The war was no longer about defending Germany or protecting the German people. It had become about Hitler's own ego, his refusal to admit failure, his determination to take the entire nation down with him, rather than face defeat. And then came July 20th, 19. A group of German officers, convinced that Hitler was leading Germany to total annihilation, organized an assassination attempt. The conspiracy included some of the most distinguished names in the German military. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, a war hero who had lost an eye, a hand, and 2 fingers in combat. General Ludwig Beck, former chief of the General Staff. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, General Friedrich Olbricht. Their plan was simple. Stauffenberg would attend a military conference with Hitler at the Wolf's Lair. He would place a briefcase containing a bomb under the conference table, and then leave. The bomb would kill Hitler. The conspirators would then seize control of the government, negotiate peace with the Western Allies, and try to save what remained of Germany. On July 20th, Stauffenberg attended the conference. He placed the briefcase under the heavy oak table, as close to Hitler as possible, and then excused himself, claiming he needed to make a phone call. The bomb exploded at 12:42 p.m. The conference room was destroyed. 4 men were killed, but Hitler survived. Someone had moved the briefcase to the other side of the heavy table support. The blast was deflected. Hitler suffered burst eardrums, burns, and shock, but he was alive. The assassination attempt failed. The coup collapsed. The Gestapo rounded up the conspirators. Stauffenberg was shot that same night. Thousands of others were arrested in the following weeks and months. Many were tortured. Some were hanged with piano wire. Their executions filmed for Hitler to watch. Rommel, implicated in the conspiracy though his exact role remains debated, was given a choice: face trial and public execution, with his family persecuted, or commit suicide and be given a state funeral with his family protected. He chose suicide. On October 14, 1944, he took cyanide. The official story was that he had died from his injuries from an earlier air attack. The failed assassination attempt had devastating consequences for the German military. The officer corps was purged. The Wehrmacht was forced to adopt the Nazi salute instead of the traditional military salute. Hitler trusted his generals even less than before. Decision-making became even more centralized, with Hitler micromanaging battles from hundreds of miles away. What does it say about a leader when his own generals, the men who had sworn oaths of loyalty, try to kill him to end a war? It says that even those closest to power knew the truth, that Hitler refused to accept. The war was lost. Continuing to fight was not heroism, but madness. Every day the war continued meant more German cities destroyed, more German soldiers killed, more German civilians dead. But Hitler would not stop, could not stop. To surrender was to admit everything had been for nothing. 1945. The final collapse. By January 1945, the situation was hopeless by any rational measure. Soviet forces were advancing through Poland, racing toward Berlin itself. In the west, Allied armies had recovered from a brief setback in the Battle of the Bulge, and were crossing the Rhine River into Germany proper. Allied bombers flew over German cities day and night, dropping thousands of tons of explosives, turning cities into wasteland. The German army was a shadow of its former self. Divisions existed on paper, but had only a fraction of their authorized strength. Teenage boys and old men were being conscripted into the Volkssturm, a desperate home guard, armed with whatever weapons could be found. Fuel was so scarce that tanks sat immobile. The Luftwaffe had lost air superiority completely. Inside his bunker in Berlin, Hitler issued orders to armies that no longer existed. He commanded phantom divisions to counterattack. He ordered non-existent reinforcements to relieve surrounded cities. He moved pins on maps representing units that had been destroyed weeks or months earlier. His staff watched in a mixture of horror and pity as their leader descended into complete delusion. He raged at maps, screaming at generals who dared to report the truth. He blamed everyone for Germany's situation, the generals for their incompetence, the soldiers for their cowardice, the German people for their weakness, everyone but himself. When generals tried to explain that the orders couldn't be followed because the units didn't exist, Hitler accused them of treason. When they tried to explain that cities couldn't be held because there were no supplies, he called them defeated. Reality had become his enemy, and he refused to acknowledge it. On April 22, 1945, during a military conference in the bunker, Hitler finally broke completely. Soviet forces were now inside Berlin itself, fighting street by street toward the center. The bunker shook with the impact of artillery shells. Maps showed red arrows converging on the city from all directions. There was no escape, no miracle, no hope. Witnesses described Hitler shaking uncontrollably, his face pale, his voice rising to a scream. He slammed his fists on the conference table. Papers flew everywhere. He screamed that the war was lost, that everyone had betrayed him, that he should have listened to his instincts and purged the officer corps years earlier. He sent everyone out of the room except for his closest aide. When they returned, his voice was quiet, almost calm, drained of emotion. He announced that he would stay in Berlin until the end. He would not flee to the mountains. He would not seek asylum. He would die in Berlin, in the capital of the Reich he had built. It was the first time in years that Adolf Hitler had openly admitted that the war was lost. After years of denial, after millions of deaths, after the destruction of his country, he finally spoke the words aloud. But even then, even at the very end, was it true realization, or was it simply the final tantrum of a man who could not accept responsibility for his own catastrophic failures? April 30, 1945, the end. The final days in the bunker were surreal. Above ground, Berlin was dying. Soviet tanks rumbled through the streets, buildings burned, civilians who hadn't fled huddled in cellars. SS troops executed soldiers and civilians for defeatism, hanging them from lampposts with signs around their necks. Below ground, in the bunker, a strange calm had descended. Hitler knew the end was near. Soviet troops were now blocks away. The sound of fighting echoed through the concrete corridors. There was no more pretense, no more talk of miracle counterattacks or wonder weapons. On April 29, Hitler married Eva Braun, his longtime companion. It was a brief civil ceremony conducted by a minor official. They signed the marriage certificate in the early hours of April 30. A small wedding celebration followed, champagne and cake in a bunker while the world above burned. Hitler then dictated his political testament, his final message to the German people and to history. It was a document of stunning self-delusion and blame-shifting. He claimed he had never wanted war, that it had been forced on him by international Jewish conspiracies. He blamed the generals for military failures. He blamed the German people for lacking the strength to. He accepted no responsibility for anything. In the afternoon of April 30, Hitler said goodbye to his staff. He shook hands. He spoke quietly. Some who were there said he seemed almost at peace, as if relieved that the burden was finally lifting. He retreated to his private quarters with Eve. His valet Heinz Linger stood guard outside. Other staff members waited in nearby rooms, though they tried not to hear what might come next. At approximately 3:30 p.m., a single gunshot echoed through the bunker. When his aides entered, they found Hitler slumped on a sofa, a pistol on the floor near his right hand,
blood running from a bullet wound to his head. Eva Braun lay beside him, dead from cyanide poisoning. The smell of almonds, characteristic of cyanide, filled the small room. As Hitler had ordered, their bodies were carried up the bunker stairs to the Reich Chancellery garden. Gasoline was poured over them. They were set on fire while Soviet artillery shells continued to fall on Berlin. The cremation was incomplete. The bodies were partially burned, then hastily buried in a shell crater. Soviet troops would discover the remains days later. Stalin, paranoid and suspicious, refused to believe Hitler was really dead. The bodies were secretly moved multiple times. It would be decades before the full truth emerged. The man who had promised to build an empire that would last 1,000 years, ended his life in a concrete hole beneath the ruins of his capital. The empire he built lasted 12 years. The legacy he left was destruction, on a scale the world had never seen. So when did Hitler realize Germany would lose World War II? The question haunts historians because the answer is both simple and impossibly complex. Hitler realized it multiple times. Each major defeat brought a moment of clarity, a glimpse through the fog of his own delusions. He realized it in December 1941, when the Wehrmacht retreated from Moscow, and he understood for a brief moment that the Soviet Union would not collapse as he had predicted. He realized it in February 1943, when the Sixth Army surrendered at Stalingrad, and the myth of German invincibility died in the frozen ruins of that city. He realized it in July 1943, when Operation Citadel failed at Kursk, and he knew Germany would never again have the strength for a major offensive. He realized it in June 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, and he understood that Germany now faced enemies on all sides with no hope of victory against all of them. He realized it in July 1944, when his own officers tried to kill him because they believed it was the only way to save Germany. He realized it in January 1945, when Soviet forces entered Germany itself, and the fiction of defending the Reich became impossible to maintain. He realized it in April 1945, when he screamed in his bunker that the war was lost, and everyone had betrayed him. Each time, he saw the truth. Each time, he pushed it away. Each time, he chose to keep fighting rather than face the reality of his failure. Hitler's tragedy was not that he failed to see defeat coming, it was that he saw it clearly, repeatedly, and chose to ignore it every single time. He realized he would lose, and he kept fighting anyway. Not because he believed victory was possible, but because surrender meant admitting he had been wrong. And for a man who had built his entire identity, his entire ideology, on being right, on being chosen by destiny, that admission was more terrifying than death itself. In the end, Adolf Hitler did not lose World War II because of superior Allied forces, though they were superior. He did not lose because of strategic mistakes, though he made many. He lost because he could not accept reality. He built an empire on lies and delusion, and when reality finally caught up with those lies, he chose to destroy everything rather than admit the truth. The bunker where he died still exists, buried beneath a parking lot in Berlin. Tourists walk over it every day, unaware of the history beneath their feet. The site is unmarked, deliberately. Germany wanted no shrine, no place for neo-Nazis to gather and worship. Perhaps that's the most fitting monument. The man who wanted to be remembered for 1,000 years is now forgotten ground, paved over and ignored. Looking back from our perspective, it's easy to ask how this could have happened. How could an entire nation follow one man into such catastrophic destruction? How could intelligent, educated generals continue to obey orders they knew were leading to disaster? How could millions of ordinary people participate in or tolerate such evil? But maybe we're asking the wrong questions. Maybe the question isn't how it happened in Germany. Maybe the question is how we can recognize the warning signs in our own time. Because the lesson of Hitler's refusal to accept reality isn't just about him, it's about human nature. It's about the danger of leaders who value pride over truth, ideology over reality, ego over the lives of their people. How many leaders throughout history have made similar choices? How many have seen disaster approaching and chosen to double down rather than change course? How many have sacrificed millions rather than admit a mistake? History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it echoes, and the echo of Hitler's final years still resonates, because the question isn't just about when he realized Germany would lose. The question is why. Even after he knew, he kept fighting. Why he dragged an entire nation into the abyss with him rather than face the simple truth that he had been wrong. Perhaps that's the real lesson here, that the most dangerous leaders aren't the ones who never see their mistake. They're the ones who see them clearly and choose pride over mercy, ego over reason, destruction over surrender. They're the ones who would rather rule over ashes than admit they were wrong. The Third Reich was supposed to last 1,000 years. It lasted 12. But its lessons, if we're wise enough to learn them, should last forever.